All right, hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 11. And in this lecture, we're going to take a look at voter turnout, state electoral laws, and the impact on participation. All right, so there's two major things we're going to cover in this lecture. Thing one is current trends in voter turnout, and thing two is state electoral laws and the impact that has potentially on political participation. So let's get started. So let's start with defining some terms. When we talk about voter turnout, what are we talking about? Well, voter turnout is the percentage of eligible individuals who actually turn up to vote. So here's a silly example, but hopefully it will help you understand what voter turnout is. So imagine that you live in a city, and that it's a really small city, and in that city there are 150 people, and 100 of those people are eligible to vote. Let's say the other 50 are children and they're not eligible to vote yet. And let's say that of those 100 eligible voters, 60 people actually vote. So lo and behold, voter turnout is 60%. So that's what we mean when we talk about voter turnout. So since the 1960s, turnout in presidential election has been about 60%. It's gone a little bit lower at it's different points in our history. Here we're talking about sort of current or contemporary trends in voter turnout. But it's been mostly consistent around 60%. That means that 6 out of every 10 eligible voters in the United States is voting. Now, for non-presidential election years, the turnout is much lower. Okay, and so we're going to be talking more about this in the next unit as well, the next topic as well. So generally, turnout in non-presidential years, those are known as midterm elections, that those turnout is about 36%, 35%. Now in 2018, it was much higher, 54%. But that, I don't know if that is portending the future of midterm election turnouts. Donald Trump was elected in 2016. He was a very controversial president. People were pretty angry about it. They showed up to vote in 2018. Okay, and so that we'll see if that trend continues into the future. When you look at general voter turnout in the United States, when you take the average of voter turnout at the state level, at the local level, and at midterms, in the presidential election, voter turnout in the United States is relatively low compared to other countries. Okay, and so let's take a look at a graph that lets us do first that looks at voter trends over time, and then we'll take a look at the United States, comparing the United States voter turnout to other countries. Okay, so in the last slide, hey, let me put my magic pen on here. In the last slide, I was talking about since 1960, okay, here, that voter turnout in presidential elections has kind of hovered around 60%. So this is the 60% line. And, that's sort of true. It's gone down, up, up a little bit, a little bit above 60%, right? But it's been pretty stable, both in the midterm elections and also presidential elections from that time forward. But what's really cool, I love this graph. It's from the U.S. Elections Project from the University of Florida. What I like about this graph is that it shows you not just contemporary trends, but it shows you like trends from the founding. And so, here, the United States, 1789 is when the United States Constitution is ratified. And the blue line is presidential elections, and the red line is midterm elections. Now, I want you to take a moment and look at that graph and sort of ask yourself, what's kind of interesting about this graph? Like, what are some sort of trends that you see? Okay, let's take a moment. All right, we're back. One of the things that I found was really interesting here is that usually today, contemporary world, turnout in presidential elections, the blue line is higher, significantly higher than turnout in the midterm elections when the president is not being elected. So, our upcoming midterm election will be 2022. President's not up for re-election, but 1/3 of the Senate and all of the House of Representatives is. But check it out, in our founding, midterm elections were actually, more people showed up for midterm elections than they did for the presidential election, right? And in fact, turnout for presidential elections is pretty dang low, you know. You might be thinking, what is going on there, right? And what changed? Well, I think what's going on there is, you know, the framers felt that the legislature was the most important body. It was going to have the most power. And the presidency was not very big. It wasn't going to have as much power, and it didn't have as much power. And that's reflected in the kinds of elections that you show up for. Today, we're like, I don't really need to elect my senator. Not that big of a deal. But you probably wouldn't sit out a presidential election. It was just the opposite back at the you know, in the early you know, first 50 years of the or so of the United States. That changes when John Quincy Adams, which was a really controversial election, you know, he was challenged by Andrew Jackson, and that the Democratic Republicans had been in power for a really long period of time. And then you see the development of other parties and some challenges to that. And so, you know, elections become more competitive, and we see this sort of rise in the importance of presidential elections. And you really see this high voter turnout, right? That's at 80% of voter turnout, and 70% for midterm elections, so a much higher rate of turnout. You might be sort of wondering why that is. Well, keep in mind this is voter eligible population. And so when the group of people who can vote is smaller, you're more likely to have more people show up to vote. You had to have property to vote. You had to be white to vote. You had to be a guy to vote. You had to be a man to vote, right? The voting population was small. But then, you know, passage of the in 1870 of the 17th Amendment, and so that's right around this time. And then in 1920, where the passage of the 19th Amendment, the pool of eligible voters increases. And that, as we know, African Americans, there were still tons of restrictions of voting for them, barriers for voting. And same with women. I talk about this in my sex, power, and public policy class, that once people are worried about giving women the right to vote because they're like, oh, they're going to vote and change everything. Well, women didn't turn out to vote initially. It takes a while to figure out how to be a voter and be socially comfortable with it. And so you sort of see that voting eligible population is large, and those who show up to vote is smaller. Okay, so just some interesting trends in voter turnout over time. So here's a graph from your textbook that compares the United States to other countries. So let me put my magic pen on here again. And here's the United States. And this is turnout in national elections and looking at it over time. So it's kind of it's combining turnout in midterm elections with presidential elections. And so we're at about 40%, right? That would make sense. And so we're well behind other countries that are like us: Canada, the United Kingdoms, Japan. And so, you know, basically we have lower levels of voter turnout, and there might be some reasons for that. Well, countries that have really high levels of voter turnout, like Australia and Brazil, you know, you have compulsory voting. You have to vote, right? Doesn't mean you have to actually cast a vote, but you have to show up and say you're not going to vote, right? But you're going to get a fine if you don't vote. A lot of other countries have the voting day is a weekend or holiday, so that can contribute to convenience voting, lowering barriers to people to vote. And, you know, this is voter registration, where it just happens automatically. You don't have to take any action to vote. And so it's possible that some of those convenience voting methods, you know, increase the participation in the United States. You'll see that the United States does not have any of those things in place, and that might contribute to our lower level of voter turnout. The next thing that we're going to talk about is who votes, okay? And so that, you know, when, you know, some people choose to vote and some people choose not to vote. And so what are the factors that explain why people actually turn up to vote? And your textbook talks about multiple factors that explain why people vote. And we're going to focus on one of the three that your textbook talks about, the three general categories. One is, and I'll leave it to you to read about this, it's very interesting, and I can kind of summarize what's in the chapter right now. But that there are socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that and attitudes about politics. All of those contribute to why a person may cast a vote. So what do I mean by that? Well, people with a higher level of education are more likely to vote than people with a lower level of education. Why is that? Well, it's very likely that with a higher level of education, you might be more informed about what's going on. You might have a job that is more of a professional white collar job that gives you the opportunity to engage in politics more. Don't have to ask off usually to go vote if you're a white collar worker. You're not punching the clock. And that also with education comes a higher level of income, and people with a higher level of income oftentimes are more likely to vote. People with less education and lower income levels, that they are less likely to vote. And that could very well be less education, might not know as much about what's going on. Less education means that you might have to work more jobs. You might want to vote, but your education hasn't led you to get a high paying job. So you've got to work a lot of jobs. You just might not have the time and the energy to commit to that. There's a difference in terms of voter turnout among men and women. Women, maybe it would be a surprise to you, but women are more likely to vote than men. Not by a lot, a couple of percentage points more likely to vote. But it's still an important difference. There's not a huge gap between African Americans and white Americans in the United States in terms of voter turnout. There has been in the past, but not as much now. But there is a very big gap between Latino Americans and other groups in terms of voter turnout. Latino Americans are less likely to vote. Also attitudes. If you have a low level of political efficacy, you don't trust government, you're probably not going to show up, right? Trust government, have a higher level of political efficacy, more likely to show up. You can read more about that in the textbook. The political environment during the election, okay? We saw that with 2018, right? Midterm elections, not usually a high voter turnout. Things were heated and polarized during the midterm elections in 2018. People showed up to vote, right? Because they were agitated and they were, for whatever reason, they either wanted to, defend Donald Trump and say, we're going to vote in the midterms because we like him. Or you could say, I hate Donald Trump, going to vote in the midterms, send a message to him that we don't like his kind of politics. When elections are more competitive, when it seems like each candidate has a chance to win, that can also increase voter turnout. And then what we are going to talk about is electoral laws and the impact that electoral laws at the state level can have on voter turnout. Okay, so the Constitution gives states control over elections within their borders, including elections to the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, those federal elections. It makes sense thinking about why, some of the interests and values that were in place when the Constitution was created. The framers did not want to give too much power to the federal government. They wanted to leave power to the states. And one of the ways that they can do that is say, states, it's up to you to determine how you want your elections to be conducted. And you find that in Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. So when it comes to laws like voter qualification, laws regarding registering to vote, polling hours, the types of ballots that can be used, all of that is determined by the states. Now, keep in mind that these state laws cannot violate the United States Constitution. And so when you say state laws that govern voter qualification, states can't say women can't vote, because there's the 19th Amendment, or African Americans can't vote because we got the 15th Amendment. But they do determine what residency requirements that, in one state, maybe you need to be a resident for 5 days, then you can vote. Maybe in another state, 20, 60, 90 days, states get to determine that kind of voter qualification. They also determine voter qualification as it relates to if you're a felon. In some states, felons lose the right to vote for their entire life, even when they're done with their sentence. In other states, felons can vote even if they're incarcerated, right? And so that's a question of voter qualification, and it's different state by state. In Wisconsin, felons do regain their right to vote after they are done with their sentence, and that would be after their term of incarceration and any state supervision that they would have post incarceration. And so all states implement voting and election laws differently, and that can have an impact on voter turnout rates depending on the state. That if a state makes it easier to vote, then you're going to maybe have a higher level of voter turnout. If a state makes it more difficult to vote, it's going to have an impact on voter turnout. So states have control over two major aspects of voter requirements. One is voter registration, and the other is voter ID laws. And so depending on what state you live in, that before you vote, you have to be registered to vote. And depending on what state you live in, sometimes you have to be registered well in advance of the election. Sometimes you can register at the day of the election. And in some states, if you are a resident of a state, you are automatically registered to vote. You don't need to take any action. And so Wisconsin has same day registration, not automatic registration. So if you are not registered to vote, you can go to the polling place, and with proper identification, you can register on the same day that the election is. So you register to vote, and then you go and vote. A lot of people say don't do registration on the day. Try to do it in advance so that you don't, because it could take a long time if there are lines, but you can do it if you want to. When I went to grad school in Indiana. In Indiana at that time, and I think it still does today, you had to register well prior to the election. And so when I was there, you had to register at least 60 days, if I recall, before the election. And so if you didn't remember to register and you were new to the area, then you couldn't vote in an upcoming election. And some states, again, just make it automatic that once you are you're a resident of the a resident of Wisconsin or whatever state it is, although Wisconsin doesn't have this, you are automatically registered. It's like the default is you don't have to take action to register, but that you just are automatically registered, and so you don't have to worry. You can go ahead and vote. Voter ID laws also vary state to state. Some states don't have any voter ID laws. Some states have pretty strict voter ID laws, like they do in the United States. The goal of voter ID laws is to prevent fraud. You want the person who's voting to be the actual person who should be voting, right? You should show, like you only want people who live in Milwaukee, who live in Wisconsin, or are eligible residents to vote in the election. It's supposed to prevent fraud. How extensive research has shown that fraud is very rare and voter impersonation is virtually non-existent. But that better safe than sorry, might as well have voter ID laws. And so, in Wisconsin, you have to show an ID with your photo on it in order to vote. That you can show your driver's license, a U.S. passport, a U.S. military ID. But you can also get an ID through the DMV if you don't have a driver's license. But getting one can be somewhat onerous. When the law was implemented in 2015, it was a lot of students said that it was really difficult to get the voter ID, the ID that they needed in order to participate in elections in Wisconsin. And so there have been some concerns about the impact that voter ID laws have had on turnout. But that is, as it says there, it's hard, it's tricky business trying to figure out the impact of voter ID on voter turnout. And most studies are showing that while it may have somewhat of an impact on voter turnout, that the impact has not been large enough to actually swing an election. And so that's what the recent research is saying. So this is a graph from your textbook that basically shows you the different kinds of voter ID laws that we have in place in the United States. So you can definitely see that there is a patchwork, and this is of 2018. And following the election of 2020, you're going to be reading about that this week. There may be an institution of more strict voter ID laws moving forward. States in red have strict voter ID laws, and so the magic pencil here, Wisconsin has a strict voter ID laws. The gray have no voter ID requirements, so you see that. And then the other colors are somewhere in between. Okay, so your textbook also talks about convenience voting. Should we make it easier? Should states make it easier to vote? One convenience voting is the same day registration or automatic registration. Many states do not have same day or automatic registration, but evidence shows that voters who are registered are more likely to vote. So once you're registered, the chance of you voting really increases. And so making it easier to register to vote could increase voter turnout. That another convenience that could potentially increase voter turnout is voting by mail. So some states like Colorado have vote by mail. That's the only way that you vote. That is the method for voting. There's been little to no evidence of fraud within Colorado's that they're voting by mail. It's one of the least fraudulent even though there's not a lot of fraud in voting. Methods within the United States. Also, that some states have no reason absentee voting. During the pandemic, we had that in Wisconsin. You didn't have to give a reason for why you wanted an absentee ballot. But moving out of pandemic, that a lot of states are not going to allow. That you have to have a reason to have an absentee ballot, that you're infirmed or that you are disabled, and only people with those kinds of issues can get the absentee voting ballot. Everybody else needs to show up to the polls on the day of election. Early in-person voting, so making it so that you can vote prior to the actual voting day, that's also seen as a convenience voting measure. It increases the opportunities that people have to vote. They may be busy on the day of the election, but they can come on a day, and oftentimes that early in-person voting is on the weekend, making it easier for people to vote. Now, since the 2020 election, that based on false claims of the election being stolen, many states have passed laws making it more difficult to vote. Okay. And so you're going to be reading an article for this week about states and this move to actually move away from convenience voting, prohibiting absentee voting, having very limited or no early in-person voting. That you'll see that there are many states that are implementing these kinds of restrictive voter laws in a response to the false claims regarding the stolen election in 2020. So make sure you read the 538 article for this week, because there will be a question on the quiz about that. And here's just a graph from your textbook that shows you the convenience voting in 2018. And so it shows that, places that have early voting, places that have early voting and no excuse absentee voting, all mail-in voting. See, there's Colorado. Get my magic pen there so you can see Colorado here as all mail-in voting. Same with Washington and Oregon have that as well. And then states that have the yellow are same-day registration, and that is Wisconsin. So in conclusion, just some things to think about as it relates to voter turnout. Is low voter turnout a cause for concern? Is that something that we should be concerned about? When you think about, turnout rates of 40% for midterm elections, that means 60% of people aren't voting. Voting in local elections is even lower, even though we haven't talked about that. And even 60% for presidential elections, that means that a strong plurality of people aren't showing up to vote. What, if any, mechanisms would you support to make voting easier? Would you want to move voting to the weekends? Would you like to have no excuse absentee voting? Did you vote that way in 2020? Did you like it? Would you like to keep it? And do you think states should adopt more uniform electoral laws with this increased trust in the sanctity of the electoral process? So all of those are some questions to think about. All right, thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.